Hardly a day goes by that you don't hear something about homeland security. But did you know that one of the biggest terrorist threats could be here in our very own backyard, behind me at the Los Angeles Long Beach Port Complex? It is the country's busiest and one of the biggest. More than 40% of the nation's imports arrive at this 10,000-acre facility, making it a potential conduit for terrorist weapons or a target in and of itself. Though security around the ports has tightened since 9/11, there's still much to do. Our special correspondent, Judy Muller, takes a look at the difficult task of protecting our ports.
From this unmarked room in a small San Pedro building, officers of the Marine Exchange scan the horizon for ships approaching the Los Angeles Long Beach Harbor. Think of this as an air traffic control center, but for ships instead of aircraft.
The cluster of white that you see around here actually represents the locations and names of all of the vessels that are in port right now. That's approximately 40 to 45 vessels.
For years, the chief concern of these officers was preventing ship collisions or averting another Exxon Valdez-type oil spill. Since 9/11, their main focus has turned to terrorism.
I take it it's first time here. Is that the reason that they're boarding it? Yeah. Okay. Magenta is a vessel of interest to us. It's color-coded that the captain of the port has some level of interest. And that may be because the ship needs to be screened before it gets to anchorage.
It was after 9/11 that the port started looking very vulnerable to the nation's security experts. Amy Ziegart has been a foreign policy advisor to both Bill Clinton and George W. Bush.
While we tend to think that there is an endless array of terrorist targets, if you really zero in on what targets in our country are most vulnerable, then you get really worried about ports quickly. And then if you start looking at port security, the mother of all port complexes is where we're standing right here.
That's why some security experts have identified the LA Long Beach Port Complex as the #1 terrorist target in the state of California. It's nothing less than the nerve center for the nation's economy. Almost all of America's imported goods comes in by ship, and nearly half of those imports arrives right at this one port.
This is by orders of magnitude bigger than any other port in the country. This port complex is the busiest in the country, 5th busiest in the world. It handles more cargo than all of our East Coast ports combined. If there were a terrorist attack at this port, global shipping would likely come to a grinding halt.
That's what makes port security a double-barrel dilemma. John Holmes was Coast Guard captain of the port on 9/11.
No other type of critical infrastructure in the country is both the conduit and the target.
Conduit for?
The conduit for bringing something bad in and the target in and of itself. So that should be a signal that we've got to look at the ports.
Why should people who don't live in Los Angeles care about an incident that could affect this port?
Because it's going to affect them as well. Soon they won't have gas for their cars, they won't have goods to buy in the grocery store or clothes to buy in the stores. They won't be able to get what they need where they need to get it. This country and the world are built around a global trading system, so it would affect all of us in very real ways.
And very quickly?
And very quickly.
But where do you start in securing a target that's spread out over 10,000 acres? How vulnerable is the port here?
Oh, quite vulnerable. This port is wide open. We have open seas, open channels. There are over 15,000 small craft. We have over 11,000 independent truckers that frequent the port. It's a port that, quite frankly, prides itself in its commerce, and to have a strong commerce, you have to have the openness.
It's a big job balancing the demand of global trade with the need for a secure port. But when national security dollars were being doled out in Washington, the ports got a small fraction of the amount that went to the airports.
The reality is people travel on airplanes, so they're intimately familiar with getting that process. People are not familiar with the port process or how goods come in from overseas. The best way I can capture it is in a short phrase, and that is cargo doesn't vote.
I don't understand why there's not more leadership on this issue at the federal level. I think if you look at the 9/11 Commission report, since 9/11, we as a country have spent 20 times more in aviation security than port security. It's crazy. We're spending all this money trying to prevent the last disaster rather than anticipating the next one.
The job of port security is divided among 15 different agencies from 5 different political jurisdictions. the Marine Exchange, the LA Port Police, the Long Beach Police Department and Long Beach Fire Department, the LAPD, and on and on. But it's the U.S. Coast Guard at the top of the security food chain. And like all the other agencies, they've stepped up their operations since 9/11.
And when I was in last time, our main focus was search and rescue and local law enforcement, boating under the influence. That was kind of our main focus on board stations, small boat stations.
And since 9/11?
Homeland Security.
A primary concern is the smaller boats like this one. These Coast Guard officers remembered that it was a small boat that blew up the USS Cole in 2000. Over at the Los Angeles Port Police Department, they've expanded the number of dive team expeditions. The job of these divers is to look for bombs that may have been placed under piers or on anchored vessels.
Searching for underwater explosive devices, these two are typical sizes, is truly a needle in the haystack operation. This port has 43 miles of waterfront, 23 cargo terminals, several major bridges, and an untold number of piers.
And the traffic in and out of the ports is mind-boggling. Every day, ships from around the world bring in an average of 12,000 containers, bound for points throughout the U.S. These containers just arrived from China, and U.S. Customs agents want to take a closer look using a special X-ray machine.
That's the device right there?
That's where the element is, that's correct.
And so it just goes down?
And takes a picture, a snapshot of the entire container, and it allows the officers to determine whether or not there are some anomalies that we should be concerned about.
The problem is that even with the increased scrutiny, there's only enough time and money to inspect a tiny proportion of these inbound containers.
It's still really bad. Only 5% of shipping containers entering this country are inspected, and inspection is a loose term. The reality is we have very little idea of what's actually inside these shipping containers when they come to the harbor.
The LA port community was shaken by a report from federal investigators which concluded that the system was failing to inspect many high-risk cargo containers. But the dock workers who load and unload the ships were not surprised. Director of Port Security for the Longshoremen's Union is Mike Mitry.
I drive we call them a hammerhead crane. They're the gantry cranes over the top of the ship, and I unload containers to and from the ship to the dock.
When you're doing that, does it ever occur to you that a container could be dangerous, could blow up, or do you just never think of that?
One of the things that happened, for example, was one night they had about 40 people that jumped out of a container after it was unloaded onto the dock, and they were running around and they were looking for someone to probably pick them up. But we thought in terms of what happened if these people had a dedicated agenda other than just coming here for jobs. I mean, if they can come that way, then other things could happen.
Sure, you could have terrorists in a container.
That's just what happened at an Israeli port when terrorists burst out of a cargo container, killing 10 and injuring 16. That's why security experts believe that we need to know more about these containers before they leave for their journey to the U.S.
What you really have to do is push the borders back. So what you have to do is a lot more scanning overseas, a lot more looking at cargo overseas, because nobody wants to be in the job I was in, captain of the port, and be the guy that says the good news is we found the dirty bomb in the container. The bad news, it's already sitting in the container terminal in L.A.
What's one thing that could be done right now that would make you more optimistic about port security?
There's new technology out there that allows you to scan the contents of a container as it's moving through on a truck towards a port. And that information can be downloaded and accessible to officials here in the United States well before that ship is steaming its way to this country.
And how optimistic are you that that would be done?
Well, it is being done in Hong Kong right now, and the challenge is a leadership one.
In a report done by the Democratic members of the Homeland Security Committee, port security was given a grade of C-D+.
I think that ports are probably worse than that. I'd probably give them a D-. But not because of what the ports are doing, because officials in Washington have not dedicated the attention or the resources or the time and expertise